Some people experience life-changing moments like a light bulb turning on in their brain. For me, it's always a sound. Ding! It's that moment when the clarity of an idea or concept I've seen, heard, or read cuts through all the competing information and advice, and suddenly, I can't think of anything else. Sometimes it's a phrase that pops into my head, fully formed, assembled on the edges of sleep. Wherever it's from, the moment is caused by a concept that rings so true and feels so right that my thoughts, behaviors, and life seem to separate into before and after I came across it. As with the proverbial bell you can't unring. You can't get healthy by being unhealthy. Ding! A story is an argument. Ding! The best predictor of behavior is belief. Ding! I've seen others experience the same reaction when I've repeated these phrases to them. Their thinking changed, as mine had, and their actions did too. Then they would tell others, and the concept would carry forward, seeming to ring and repeat on its own. I became obsessed with that imagined sound. I wanted to understand why it happened, figure out how to create it myself, and, if I could, teach others how to do the same. And then one day, I heard that ding for real. An instructor was demonstrating sympathetic resonance with two tuning forks on resonance boxes, set a short distance apart. When the instructor struck one tuning fork with a rubber mallet, that fork vibrated and emitted a loud, clear tone. A few seconds later, the instructor touched the fork with his hand. The vibration stopped, but the tone continued. How was that possible? The answer, as I soon discovered, was that the first fork's tone resonated so strongly with the second fork across from it that the second fork began to vibrate and create the same tone on its own, even though the instructor hadn't touched it. Ding! As someone who had spent 25 plus years in change communications, I had to know, was it possible to build a case for change that created the same reaction in the same way, but with people? By tuning a message for maximum resonance, was it possible to inspire the desire for change in other people so that it became their own? And unlike tuning forks, whose sound eventually fades away, was it possible for that desire and change to last? The answer is a resounding yes. When you understand the principles behind how this kind of sympathetic response happens, you can recreate it yourself. The same is true in communication, especially communication about change. When you understand the principles that transfer the desire for change, or any idea, to someone else, you can craft your messages to create the same effect. That's why I wrote this book, to teach you the fundamental principles of lasting change so you can create it with your communications too. Nothing happens without change, but a failed change carries huge consequences. Companies invest hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars on internal and external change efforts and new leadership only for the change to miss projections or fail entirely. New product launches don't launch, brand pivots don't pivot, mergers don't merge. As a result, customers and clients churn and employees burn out. In the startup world, founders spend countless hours trying to secure the capital to fund their vision of change, only to see the cash run out before their hopes do. Nonprofit leaders know their organization's ability to deliver on critical missions often rests on how well they and their teams can make their case for change. But they, too, struggle to find new donors as quickly as previous donors stop giving. Political and interest group leaders, charged with leading the movements, creating the policies that can change societies and even our world, struggle to gain traction with new or opposing groups. Necessary change too often stalls or slides backward, perpetuating inequality and injustice. In every case, the leaders of these changes put their personal and professional reputations on the line. When a needed change doesn't happen, people take the failure personally. They start looking for who's to blame, even though, as you'll discover, the fault all too often lies in the case for change itself, in how it was articulated, presented, or understood. Regardless, Assigning blame after the fact doesn't solve the core challenge of how to make change happen in the first place. Maybe you're one of those leaders working to make change happen. Whether you're trying to inspire change at the individual, organizational, or even societal level, you have too much riding on big changes to see them, and the people who will put those changes into practice, falter or fail. And yet they do, even though change is a natural state of the universe. It happens around us all the time without us having to argue about it at all. So why are people so resistant to change? Because balance and harmony are also a natural state of the universe. When things change, as they inevitably do, other things must change to maintain or restore that balance. Tuning forks are silent until struck. Something has to change before they do. They return to silence because the steel is ultimately stronger than the sound wave. Its rigidity resists change. With humans, it's our psychology that resists change. Our hardwired ability to notice what's different is an ancient survival mechanism. From a time when quickly noticing a tiger in the brush was a life or death skill. To notice what's different, though, the mind spends a lot of time trying to keep everything else the same. Change disrupts those efforts, at least initially. So, the faster someone can return to a balanced state, the better. As part of that process, the brain quickly assesses what it considers a threat. Unfortunately, people's brains consider almost any change to be a danger at first. As a result, people often respond to change with modern-day versions of the brain's instinctive fight, flight, freeze, or fawn threat responses. In the face of a disruption to the status quo, people will actively try to fight what's disrupting it. They will either leave the situation, often in the form of leaving the organization, or attempt to hide in plain sight, not fighting the change, but not helping it either. The final response, fawn, is when people try to appease or placate the source of the disruption, you. That appeasement doesn't signal agreement, though. In the case of fawning, someone is going along to get along and may change allegiances if another person or change represents an even greater threat. There are only two exceptions to this natural resistance. The first is when a proposed change doesn't register in the brain as dangerous or likely to cause harm. In that case, someone will usually attempt to ignore the change so they can focus on what they or their brains consider to be more important, such as unmet quarterly goals or a critical file that went missing, modern stand-ins for those ancient tigers. That person's behavior will usually change only when the consequence of inaction becomes a threat to their status, income, or identity. The second exception is when the change represents something a person actively wants or values. In those cases, the person will almost always take action to pursue the desired result. In ancient times, if a sudden noise turned out to be a ripe apple dropping to the ground instead of a tiger lurking nearby, our forebears would make the necessary changes to get that easy and tasty food source now that they weren't at risk of becoming one themselves. The same is true with modern-day changes. To start a theme that will carry throughout this entire book, when someone recognizes a change as a new or better way to get something they want, they'll shift their attention and actions to align with it. With all that in mind, you might find it helpful to think of the stakeholders for your change as falling into one of four groups, each representing a different level of desire for it. The actives. These are your true believers and ideal supporters, those already attuned to the change and what it will mean. Because of that, the change resonates with them and spurs them to action. Ding. They may even experience a form of sympathetic resonance, the phenomenon that causes the tuning forks to ring, and become vocal advocates for the change. The ambivalence. This next group also wants the anticipated outcome of a change, but with that desire comes dissonance. Bzzz. A tension with something else that resonates with them just as much, e.g., I want more interaction with my colleagues, but I also want my own private space. Because both action and inaction bring gains and losses, and usually in equal measure, ambivalents often appear indecisive. but that indecisiveness signals their openness to influence. They want and seek out any information that might end their internal conflict, which makes them appear to be skeptics or fence-sitters. The indifference. These are the folks who aren't interested in the change, and likely never will be. Like tuning forks that don't share tones, they're non-reactive or neutral. Silence. Whatever you say doesn't affect them one way or another because they either don't want or legitimately don't care about the outcome your approach or offering delivers. Indifferents aren't against you. They are truly agnostic. But unless or until they see how a change promises them a positive outcome, until something about it resonates, they'll never be for you either. With this group, the dissonance they feel has devolved into disagreement, clang. You can make them act, but in certain situations, antagonists may act against you instead, as protesters would. That makes them a threat to your efforts. So it's best to identify them and the source of their opposition as early as you can. Thankfully, when you apply the principles in this book, it's possible for you to turn antagonists' rejection into active and even sympathetic resonance. Yet, even when you understand what category someone falls into, sometimes you discover that your approach to creating change works in some situations, but not in others. Sales get easier, but retention becomes harder. You get a lot of interest initially, but not much action over time. You start to see the change you want take hold, and promising early results. But then the pace slows down. Old habits come back into play, and it feels as if you're somewhere worse than you were before. Nevertheless, you persist. When inspiring a change is important enough, you're willing to do just about anything to make it successful. If only you could figure out what that is. You're willing to do the hard work, and thankfully, you're not alone. The enduring demand for and popularity of books, courses, seminars, and consulting on this topic tells me that we haven't yet found something that works and keeps working for us or the people in whom we're trying to inspire lasting change. If you wish to persuade me, you must think my thoughts, feel my feelings, and speak my words. Marcus Tullius Cicero. I've seen that most leaders don't want to force or coerce people into change. They want to build true and lasting buy-in for it. They just don't know what else there is to do. And so they find themselves in a situation I call the persuader's paradox, where they use approaches to persuade others that they themselves wouldn't respond to or tolerate. Worse, most of those common approaches to driving action work against long-term change. But the secrets to lasting change aren't secret. We have cracked the code, just not, unfortunately, in business. Long before I worked in branding, marketing, and message design to help leaders create this kind of lasting change, before my brief but enduring turn as a change management consultant, and even before I studied marketing, managerial and crisis communications, and organizational behavior in school, I had my own changes that I wanted and needed to make and maintain. The lessons I learned through making and maintaining change at the individual level fundamentally shaped my approach to helping others steward changes at the organizational, market, and even societal level. When I was just 17, I was diagnosed with an often debilitating panic disorder. In a misguided attempt to calm my anxiety, I started smoking and eating. By the time I was in my mid-20s, I was 50 pounds overweight and sedentary. Even though my day jobs focused on changing minds and behavior, I struggled with how to do the same things in my personal life. The mental and physical health I so wanted felt like it was stuck on the other side of a daunting reality. It's hard to quit smoking. Most diets fail. When it came to overcoming my panic disorder, this didn't just seem hard. It seemed impossible. But I've learned there are generally two kinds of hard. There's the hard of doing the same thing over and over again with little difference in the long-term results. Before I finally succeeded, I would joke that I'd already lost 50 pounds. Unfortunately, it was the same 5 pounds, 10 times. I'd quit and restart smoking every few months. Before I overcame my panic disorder for good, I had been in and out of therapy and on and off medication for almost 18 years. I far prefer the other kind of hard. That is, making the effort up front to figure out what's most likely to work now and over the long term. This can be more work at the beginning, sure, but doing that ensures it doesn't have to be done again, because it was the right work the first time around. As the old saying and one of my life mantras goes, a stitch in time saves 9. So I wanted to figure out what approaches to making or inspiring a change, when applied at the beginning, make it more sustainable over time. What do you need to say or do to transfer the thoughts and feelings that make change last? How do you make a yes stay a yes? How do you create the ding? Once I figured it out, the answer seemed obvious. Align your approach to change with the forces that make it endure. As with the tuning forks, make a change resonate so strongly that acting on it feels inevitable. In other words, say something people can't unhear and eventually adopt as their own. A note before proceeding. If hearing is not an ability available to you or your audience, please consider the phrase, say what they can't unhear, metaphorical. The principles in this book are equally applicable to write what they can't unread, or even show what they can't unsee. So please feel free to use whatever resonates with you most. Sustainable change requires sustainable actions, and that requires sustainable shifts in outlook. In my personal life, once I started paying attention, I saw that the buzz I got from smoking was a regular contributor to my panic attacks. The action I was taking to calm down in the moment made my anxiety worse later. By pitting those two desires against each other, a technique you'll learn in Chapter 7, I realized my identity as a smoker was a lot weaker than my identity as someone who wanted to live without panic. Once I made the choice to change, I never questioned it, or smoked again. I can't remember where I first came across one of the phrases I mentioned earlier. You can't get healthy by being unhealthy. But because it rang so true for me and how I saw the world, more on that in Chapter 3, I couldn't unhear it. In fact, that phrase instantly became my guiding principle as I vetted new ways to achieve my health goals. Did it take me longer to lose the weight? Yes, it took me 3 years. But I've now maintained that loss for more than 25 years. And after 2 kids. Change will happen at the organizational, market, and societal level only if it happens at the individual level first. That's why I took my personal lessons on sustainable change and applied them to my professional work, helping leaders build buy-in for long-term and large-scale change. I've now spent over 30 years exploring and understanding what I've learned and applying it to conversations and content in all forms. Whether I was leading fundraising communications for Harvard Medical School, developing brand, content, social media, and sales messaging strategies for major corporations and startups alike, or even moonlighting as a weight loss coach or as the executive producer and idea strategist for TEDx New England, I constantly used this lens of sustainability to shape my pursuit of the ding, even when that meant completely defying conventional wisdom. Over time, I developed a set of approaches to applying these lessons and avoiding the pitfalls of inspiring and implementing change. With them, I've helped hundreds of companies raise more money, enter new markets, change long-standing policies, and even shift deep-seated perceptions, not just for a little while, but for the long term. I've worked with leaders to craft cases for change in their organizations, with investors or donors, and to audiences all over the world. I've collaborated with academics, researchers, and thought leaders on how to inspire changes, not only in individuals and organizations, but also in markets and society. Their messages have now combined to reach well over 10 million people who've seen and heard them in person and online. Eventually, my work expanded from developing change messages for myself and my clients to helping others develop their own. I started to summarize these concepts into phrases that would make them easier for me and others to remember and apply. The result is the 9 principles this book is all about. I developed each principle from my research into the fundamental aspects of how the decisions behind long-term change happen. You can find information on the science and the sources in the endnotes section at the end of this book. I've tested the principles through years of lived experience and have honed them until I could state them in a way that, ideally, makes them impossible to unhear. The first 3 principles set the foundation for how long-term change happens. The next 3 frame the primary ways that inspiring long-term changes differs from driving short-term action. The final 3 focus more specifically on how to put the principles into action to inspire the change you seek. In each chapter, I'll explain the principle and its meaning. I'll also explain why it matters, what gets in the way, and one simple thing you can do to put it into practice. You can read the principles in any order, though if you read them from start to finish, you'll see that they build on each other. As you go through the book, I hope you'll have a few ding moments of your own. If you're open to it, I'd love to know what they are. Just email me at ding@tamsenwebster.com and tell me when you come across a concept, idea, or example that you can't unhear, and might even go on to tell someone else about. Together, these principles will help you build the buy-in that leads to lasting change. That said, it's in the execution that change becomes real. Any change initiative, no matter how inspired or desired, will fail without the planning and resources required to make implementation possible. Although the principles of successful implementation warrant a book of their own, the 9 principles in this book will strengthen your case for starting the change in the first place and for securing the investments you need. It's also important to note that the principles here are not always mutually exclusive with more short-term, action-oriented approaches. In fact, many traditional persuasion and influence techniques can be even more effective when combined with the principles you'll learn here. After reading this book, you'll be able to diagnose why your or others' past efforts to steward change created the dissonance or disagreement that led to failure. You'll also be able to envision new ways to change your future approach into one that resonates in any format or forum. You'll start to see how inspiring change without the stick, authority, or pain-based measures, or the ick, manipulation, coercion, or even just I don't know how, leads to benefits far beyond the change you seek. It often leads to more people adopting a particular change and fewer regretting it afterward or regressing to previous habits or behaviors. Most importantly, you'll see that when you put these principles to work, you achieve the most enduring kind of influence in others, the kind that happens from the inside out. Ding! All of this requires one bonus principle that you already intuitively know. Persuasion is personal. Outside of a few universal truths on how change happens or doesn't, which I address in this book, the reason someone decides to change is as individual as they are. Often, as you'll see, that means not trying to persuade them at all. Instead, you'll learn how to align your approach to change with what creates the conditions for it in the first place. You'll learn that your best case for change is the case that your stakeholders would make themselves. An argument that rings true because what the change delivers and why it delivers are both based on what someone already wants and believes. Although I've written this book for those of you who want or need to inspire change in others, you may discover how the principles apply to making a long-term change in or for yourself. To inspire change that lasts, say what they can't unhear. Read on to learn why and how. Just an action. It's a reaction. R. Ignaz Semmelweis faced a grim puzzle. In 1847, the Viennese hospital where he worked had 2 maternity wards with vastly different mortality rates. The ward run by the doctors had a maternal death rate of 1 in 5, but in the ward run by the midwives, The death rate was only 1 in 50. Semmelweis believed that doctors were the cause. Because only the doctors both performed autopsies and delivered babies, he suspected, decades before germ theory was commonly accepted, that the doctors were transferring something fatal from the dead to the living. Semmelweis suggested a simple change, that doctors wash their hands between the two procedures. Even though the maternal mortality rate dropped as a result, Semmelweis's colleagues ultimately rejected the change. And him. Why? Because Semmelweis's theory didn't ring true with his colleagues' pre-existing beliefs about the causes of disease and about themselves. They believed not only that disease was carried by miasmas, that is, infected air, but also that as gentlemen doctors, they were clean by nature. Given those two beliefs, it was impossible for them to agree that they were contributing to the cause of death. As soon as Semmelweis left and hand-washing stopped, mortality rates soared again. Frustrated, Semmelweis publicly and ferociously berated those who opposed his idea, which, as you might imagine, did little to help him convince his audience. 7 years later, Florence Nightingale was nursing soldiers during the Crimean War. She also faced high mortality rates caused by infections among her patients. Like Semmelweis, she lacked knowledge of germ theory and focused on improving hygiene as a possible solution. Unlike Semmelweis, however, Nightingale was successful in making hand-washing a standard practice for doctors. Her colleagues directly credited her with reducing mortality, and history now remembers her as a pioneer of modern nursing. Why did Semmelweis fail and Nightingale succeed? The primary difference was their approach to creating change among the doctors they worked with. Semmelweis directly challenged his colleagues' long-standing beliefs, especially about their gentlemanly cleanliness, and emphasized how they were making the problem worse. Nightingale, however, took a more aligned approach. She positioned hand-washing as one of a number of measures to remove what the miasmas left behind. The doctors weren't the villains. The air was. Even though her reasoning was ultimately incorrect, by introducing a life-saving practice without confronting established norms, the change was easier to implement and its effects endured. Semmelweis and Nightingale demonstrate the negative and positive consequences of this principle. How you introduce a change can make or break your change efforts right from the beginning. What this principle means. Many of us view change as an action people take. Although that's true, it usually starts as a reaction to a change in something else, much of which is out of our control. For example, when the temperature drops, you grab a sweater. When the stock market drops, you find ways to cut expenses or opportunities to invest. You can't control the economy. You can't control the competition. You can't control world events. Even when you control which change to implement, you can't control someone's reaction to it. But how a person reacts to a proposed change, especially when they're first introduced to it, is the key to whether that change happens in the first place. It's also key to how long support for it lasts. Change may begin with external triggers, but sustained change requires an internal and renewable reward. That reward is known as intrinsic motivation, and it's the holy grail of change. When someone decides to continue acting in a new way simply because they want to, because it feels right, and because it feels like an extension of who they are and who they want to be, then the change reinforces their sense of self. For example, many leaders enjoy mentoring others, even when it's not one of their job duties. Helping someone else grow and reach their potential aligns with their values and beliefs about leadership, or even about being a good person. The more a change resonates, the more it makes people feel good about themselves and how others see them, then the more they will continue to do it. So, how can you create intrinsic motivation in someone else? You can't. Intrinsic motivation happens literally within the other person. That said, how you present a change directly affects whether it resonates enough to inspire the intrinsic motivation that lasting change requires. For internally motivated change to occur, someone must see a clear link between the action you're asking them to take and an outcome they personally desire. But that's not enough. They also need to work through their pre-existing beliefs, perceptions about how hard the change will be, and the emotions that arise as a result. We cannot ensure success, but we can deserve it. John Adams, Letter to Abigail Adams, 1776. When you initiate a change, you're often the primary source of the information that influences what other people ultimately think and feel about that change. This is why understanding change as a reaction is so critical. Much of what people are reacting to is you. Your approach can just as easily impede a change as inspire one. Align your actions with the reaction you want. Think about the last time someone failed to persuade you. Did they give you ultimatums, deadlines, or threats, implied or otherwise? Did they make you feel stupid or wrong for doing or believing what you do? And did you feel like digging in your heels and standing your ground in response? Did you say yes to get them to stop talking, knowing that you'd find a nice way to say no later? Or maybe not so nice.
If you are enjoying this book, then you belong in the Intellect Corner community. Why join? Because your voice shapes what gets made. You can request the books you want to hear and vote on other suggestions so I know exactly what to cover next. Plus, you'll get personalized reading recommendations from a community of people who share your taste. It's also the central hub. I run around 20 different channels, and the community is the easiest way to browse them, find the books you're looking for, and make sure you never lose access to our content if we ever move beyond YouTube. Click the link in the description to join Intellect Corner, and let's decide what to read next.
Trust and belief are the bedrock of change. If someone doesn't trust you, it's hard for them to believe you. According to the work of psychologist Susan Fiske and her colleagues, people assess trust based on two factors: capability and intent. When you're trying to persuade someone, they need to see you as credible and that you have the capacity and ability to deliver on the outcomes you're attaching to the change. They also need to believe you're doing it for the right reasons. Does the change serve your interests or theirs? What's your motivation? Humans are wildly attuned to intent. Our ability to quickly sense who is friend or foe has kept us safe and alive as humans for thousands of years. Most of the signals that indicate your true intent, called honest signals, are ones that you don't consciously control. People assume that if you're resorting to what they perceive as manipulation or coercion, then your intent isn't good, at least from their point of view. In other words, pushing for a yes is much more likely to produce a no. If you have the authority to set the rules, impose punishments for inaction, or dole out incentives, you know those methods, which psychologists refer to as operant conditioning, can in fact drive action in people. Sometimes those approaches are even necessary to keep someone safe or because the need for action is so urgent that you can't afford the time to get people to act on their own. But many of us may feel personal discomfort when using manipulative, coercive, or authoritarian techniques to drive change. Even when those methods work, you may feel as if you're taking advantage of people who don't know or recognize what you're doing. And even when you use those methods appropriately and with good intent, you may feel they're out of alignment with your beliefs and core values. That dissonance can find its way into your approach and taint the perception others have of your intent and you. Though dissonance in music can make it more interesting, our minds find dissonance in ideas and people nearly impossible to endure. That kind of cognitive dissonance requires resolution because it disturbs the balance and harmony people need to function well. More on that in Chapter 7. The ambivalence I mentioned in the opening note are in this dissonant state, which makes them more open to any new information or influence that would help resolve it. Once that resolution starts, though, cognitive dissonance is resolved positively to a yes or negatively to a no. There is no in-between. When the resolution is positive, dissonance turns into some form of resonance and alignment, which makes ambivalence become actives. When the resolution is negative, dissonance turns into some form of resistance and rejection, creating antagonists instead. You saw each outcome in the hand-washing example earlier. Since it would require a change in both thinking and behavior, Semmelweis's and Nightingale's suggestion to wash hands would have created cognitive dissonance in the doctors with whom each worked. It's easy to imagine that in both cases, the doctors felt torn between "I want to save lives" and "I want to do my job the way I'm used to doing it." In that ambivalent state, the doctors in each situation would have actively looked for reasons to favor one desire over another, and thus resolve the dissonance. Semmelweis's colleagues took his confrontational approach as a reason to disagree and maintain the status quo. Their dissonance was resolved negatively, eventually turning them into antagonists who rejected the change and fired Semmelweis. Because Nightingale's argument for change aligned with her colleagues' beliefs, their dissonance resolved positively, turning them into actives who supported and sustained the change. Your approach to a change, what you say about it, why and how, plays a pivotal role in its success. It often determines the direction in which dissonance resolves, positive or negative, and the strength of that negative or positive resolution. How strong those negative or positive reactions are. It can even introduce dissonance to the indifferents, who otherwise aren't experiencing it and thus aren't represented in the graphic above, which can open an opportunity to align them with your cause. Ultimately, your approach is the only contribution to change that you fully control, which is why it needs to be the first and central focus of your attention. What gets in the way? Experience has taught people to be wary of persuasion tactics. It's not uncommon for people to feel challenged or that their long-standing methods are being labeled as wrong or outdated. Although imposing your authority or bribing stakeholders with incentives can drive them to act, that kind of extrinsic motivation can also lead to resentment and unethical behavior as people act to resolve the dissonance they're feeling. It can also lead to burnout, where someone is stuck in an enduring and exhausting state of dissonance they can't resolve. Any and all of those will ultimately undermine the change you forced or coerced someone to make. If you're thinking, well, sometimes I'm glad when someone gives me a kick in the pants, you're not alone. Many of us will tolerate having others use these approaches on us, at least for a little while or for as long as they're serving us. But what about in the long term? Usually, one kick in the pants is the most we'll take. Then we want the kicking to stop. That's why, even with the best of intentions, your approach can trigger one of the greatest risks to successful change, what psychologists call reactance. Reactance is when people resist a suggested change because they feel forced to make it. When people feel trapped into agreeing to whatever it is you're asking or telling them to do, they'll do just about anything to take back control of the situation and resolve the dissonance, including saying no to things they truly want. When it comes to the process of change, coming back from a no is next to, if not fully, impossible, as Semmelweis so tragically discovered. That's why saying something someone can't unhear starts with avoiding reactance at all costs. Whenever you have the choice, be a nightingale. Putting it into practice. While you can't control where someone starts on the continuum from antagonist to active, you can control the aspects of your approach that directly affect where they end up. You control what information you present and how understandable it is to someone else. You control whether you're arguing from your point of view, theirs, or one you share. You control what you do in the interaction and how you choose to approach it. You can control what you think about the other person and your true intentions. And if you want to inspire change that lasts, you'll need to work to align all of these aspects with the rest of the principles in this book. The success of the change you want to inspire starts with the changes you're willing to make in your approach, and maybe even in yourself. The first and biggest change is learning that every decision someone makes has a story behind it, which is what we're going to explore next. has a story. Imagine it's time to replace something in your home. Let's say your dishes and flatware. You don't want to spend a lot of money, but you'd like what you buy to last at least a little while. So, off you go to the giant Swedish furniture store, IKEA, armed with a conservative budget of $200. As you wander through the maze-like aisles, you spot a Fnork flower vase that would look perfect in your kitchen. And oh, that splank tablecloth would look great with those curtains you have. And now that you think about it, if you're going to get the splank, you should also get the slumple rug that matches. After a break for some Swedish meatballs, you continue through the store. Eventually, you check out, only to discover that on top of the $200 you'd planned to spend on dishes and flatware, you've now spent $300 on things you didn't plan to buy. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. A University College London study found that 60% of purchases at IKEA are unplanned. The reason why is one of the most important elements of long-term change. Every decision has a story. What this principle means: there's no such thing as a truly rational decision, at least not in the way you traditionally think of it. What you may think of as a rational decision, a logical and conscious consideration of the pros and cons of why a decision is right or wrong, is, in reality, something you create after your brain has already decided. It's a story you tell yourself. If I get this, then my house will look better. Or, I can use this, so I'll buy it. And I need this because I want it. Notice that these decisions aren't based on once-upon-a-time stories like fairy tales, but they are similar. There's an old storytelling maxim that a story is an argument. Fables and fairy tales, for example, are stories that argue for or against a particular course of action, sometimes quite literally. Slow and steady wins the race, based on what happens to the characters and the choices they make in the face of conflict. The stories we tell others show how cause and effect work together to achieve the transformation necessary for a desired outcome, happy endings, or not so happy. The stories we tell ourselves also argue for or against a particular course of action. They're logical in the sense that they establish a logical relationship between action and outcome, but they're not rational, for two reasons. First, the cause and effect relationship is based on beliefs, many of which are the product of perceptions about others, ourselves, or the world. As you'll see in the next chapter, there are even beliefs, such as that the world is safe or dangerous, that appear to dictate what our perceptions even are. Second, our brains craft these story arguments unconsciously, before and thus without conscious, rational processing. And yet it's these logical but not rational arguments that help our brains, and thus us, make sense of the world, to describe why something has happened, is happening, or should happen. When people decide to act, it's because they've unconsciously accepted their brain's internal argument for how and why a particular action will deliver on a desired outcome. It's that argument that moves them from ambivalent or indifferent to active. People will change an action only if the story supporting it changes first. That's why any argument for change you present to a stakeholder needs to make even more sense to them than the story they're telling themselves now. Any action someone takes ends an internal argument about why doing so makes sense. If that story makes sense, the decision will too. What doesn't work internally will never work externally. Even when people's internal arguments for action aren't rational, they still feel rational because they follow their own kind of logic. They have a consistent structure with consistent elements. You already know two of them: the cause, the action or change someone makes, and the effect, a desired outcome. But stories, with only those two elements, a cause and effect, aren't valid arguments. They're assertions, conclusions without evidence, and usually aren't strong enough to drive action on their own. True arguments for change include not only the action to take and the outcome it should produce, but also the assumptions or beliefs that create the logical connection between the two. So, it's not just, if I buy this flower vase, my house will look better. To drive action, the argument must also contain why the action will deliver the outcome. For someone who wants their house to look better, the actual internal argument would go a little more like this. This fnork is a vase for flowers. Flowers make my house look better. That's why, if I buy this fnork, my house will look better. Thanks to the work of the ancient philosopher Aristotle, we know that someone will agree with the conclusion if and only if they agree with the principles and assumptions that lead to it. Unfortunately, because this argument for action happens unconsciously, people aren't aware that they've reached a conclusion, nor are they aware of the assumptions that made the conclusion true. What's more, once a person has arrived at a decision, they usually don't need the deeper rationalization that led them to the decision in the first place. In fact, people's brains are naturally wired to remember only the conclusion and save space by dumping everything else. To inspire change in others, though, you must make this implicit part of the argument explicit. You must clearly state your conclusion and the otherwise silent assumptions so that your stakeholders can determine, even if unconsciously, whether every aspect of your case is in tune with theirs. The story argument will resonate only if its structure is complete. Action won't occur without it. That introduces another reason this principle is so important. Since these stories that drive action are unconscious, they're also deeply personal. They are always influenced by someone's individual values, beliefs, desires, biases, and emotions. As a result, a person's internal arguments may not always be based on facts or reality, but they will always represent truth and reality for that particular person. That's what makes the stories people build for themselves so powerful. Recent studies confirm it. For example, researchers discovered that what's known as the IKEA effect, where people value objects they've built themselves more than those they haven't, also applies to valuing ideas. The data may be new, but the concept isn't. Mathematician and philosopher Blaise Pascal framed it this way over 300 years ago. People are generally better persuaded by the reasons which they have themselves discovered than by those which have come into the mind of others. That's why, the more you align your case with the assumptions and arguments someone already acts on, the more likely they will be to adopt and stick with the change long term. Recognizing this can transform not only how you approach presenting change, but also how well you understand others' actions and why they make the choices they do. What gets in the way? A story that would or should work for a particular person won't work if it's missing any parts of the argument behind it. Nor will it work if the person you're talking to doesn't agree with your assumptions. But more on that in Chapter 3. Unfortunately, most persuasion and influence messaging, including almost all sales and marketing messaging, leaves out the silent assumptions that make internal arguments work. Usually, the messages include only the action and outcome, leaving out any information about why one leads to the other. So, tain't no use in me telling you something, unless give you the understanding to go long with it. If you buy from us, you'll get the result you're looking for. Agree to this new compensation model because it will help you make more money. You should work with us because you said you wanted to improve your sales numbers. This one uses your own outcome against you. Ick. When you're constructing a case for change, you need to include all the elements a person would otherwise include themselves. If you don't, they will either dismiss the argument outright, because it quite literally doesn't make sense or seem logical to them, or they'll fill in the gaps with whatever actions, outcomes, or assumptions align better with what they already believe and do, which usually means concluding not to change at all. That's why, to change what people do, you must change how they see the situation, themselves, or the change itself. That means changing the stories they're telling themselves and the arguments those stories represent, which you can do only if you articulate all the elements their story-building brain requires. But when you do, you can turn what would be an ick approach into something much less likely to create resistance. Let's use the example of making the case for your business to someone who has just said they want to improve their sales numbers. Oh, so you want to improve your sales numbers? That's why we started our business in the first place. We believe that better sales numbers start with better leads. We also believe the best leads are those people who are already aligned with your approach, even if they don't know it or you exist. And that's what we've seen with our clients. When you identify those elements of alignment and build searchable content that incorporates them, you get the better leads that improve your sales numbers. When you approach a case for change this way, you're reconstructing in stakeholders' minds a version of the argument you unconsciously constructed in your own. That means you need to surface and state those often silent principles, such as better sales numbers start with better leads. In the example, that led you to your conclusion, your ding, in the first place. You can't make something impossible to unhear if someone hasn't heard or read it in the first place. But I need to stress that you're not inventing this argument or crafting one that only the other person would accept. You're excavating it from your own values, beliefs, and assumptions. That ensures everything you include in your argument is true for you, which in turn aligns your approach with the long-term outcomes you want by keeping your intent pure. See Chapter 1. After all, if you don't believe in the change, why would anyone else? Notice that this kind of case for change doesn't rely on a list of all the other advantages your approach provides. It doesn't say, you should hire us because our content produces better leads, is cheaper than hiring someone internally, and reduces overall marketing expenses. Those are benefits, which are just additional or alternative outcomes. As you'll see in Chapter 8, if someone doesn't want those outcomes in the first place, benefit bombing them with other versions of that undesired outcome just reinforces their resistance. Benefits are also not principles, the fundamental truths required for a valid argument. I'm not saying benefits aren't necessary or useful. They are, but only after someone literally agrees in principle with the change. For example, if you wanted to include those benefits in the example above, you'd do it after or as part of the conclusion, like this. We believe that better sales numbers start with better leads. We also believe the best leads are those people who are already aligned with your approach, even if they don't know it or you exist. And that's what we've seen with our clients. When you identify those elements of alignment and build searchable content that incorporates them, you get the better leads that improve your sales numbers. You'll also reduce marketing expenses because you're not wasting effort on leads who'd never convert. When additional benefits are presented after you've argued for how your approach achieves them, they further validate the other person's decision, which is a very good thing. Once you know to look and listen for arguments complete with assumptions, you'll start to notice how few there are. Yet, an incomplete argument won't make sense to people. And if the argument doesn't make sense, the action won't make sense. No number of features and benefits will fix that. For a change to last, the case must include the action and outcome, as well as the assumptions connecting the two. Putting it into practice. Although you can't rely on knowing exactly what story someone is telling themselves, you can rely on that story being the driving force behind what they do, how, and why. So, when crafting a case for change, go beyond a simple explanation of or edict for what you want to have happen. Make it an actual case, an argument people would build themselves. The more closely your argument aligns with stakeholders' internal logic, both in content and structure, the more you're directly uploading your case into the story processors of their brains. As a result, It's less likely that something will get lost in translation, and more likely that they'll be able to explain the action and their feelings about it to themselves and others. An extra step that turns actives into advocates for the change. Now that you know the structure that creates resonance in stories of change, it's time to focus on the substance, the principles that set the patterns of both our stories and our actions. Think for a moment about how you see the world. Would you be more likely to describe it as a beautiful place with treasure around every corner? Or as an ugly and boring place where exploration is unlikely to result in much of anything? These aren't random worldviews. They're examples drawn from the 26 deep-seated primal beliefs about the world identified by Dr. Jeremy Clifton and his team at the University of Pennsylvania. Their research found that these primals determine whether we see the world, for instance, as safe or dangerous, enticing or dull, alive or mechanistic. They also shape how someone feels about the world. If someone sees the world as inherently dangerous, for example, they are much more likely to be anxious. They're probably anticipating danger around every corner and acting accordingly. Why does that happen? Often, our subjective beliefs become so much a part of who we are and how we see the world that we begin to see them as principles, as universal, objective truths that not only determine what we should do and how, but what we even see as possible. In his seminal book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey describes principles as natural laws in the human dimension that are just as real, just as unchanging and unarguably there, as laws such as gravity are in the physical dimension. Because our beliefs are true to us, whether they're objectively true or not, they guide our behavior. This link between what someone thinks and how they act is critical to understanding why a particular case for change doesn't work and figuring out how to craft one that does. Imagine you're the founder of a company with a technology that captures carbon to help protect the environment. You need to raise capital to continue your work and achieve the impact you want, which means you need to craft your case to a group of potential investors. Because you believe the world is a beautiful place, you make the following argument. The world is a beautiful place that needs protection. Capturing carbon is essential to protecting the environment. That's why investing in this carbon-capturing technology will help protect our beautiful planet. If you're speaking to an investor who shares your primal belief that the world is a beautiful place that needs protection, and also your belief that carbon emissions affect the environment, then the story makes sense, as would the related action. Investing. You'd still need to show that your technology is indeed effective at capturing carbon before they'd commit. But as far as the basic idea is concerned, the investor would likely agree in principle because they agree with the principles on which you've based your case. But what if you're talking to someone who at a primal level doesn't share your belief that the world is beautiful? In that case, they literally can't agree with your argument because it's based on a principle they don't agree is true, that the world's beauty needs protection. In their minds, what is there to protect? Why would we protect an ugly world? The same is true if they don't agree with you about the consequences of carbon emissions. If the change you're making contradicts the fundamental principles they see as true, no amount of logical reasoning or compelling data will sway them. No matter how beautifully built your argument, how elegant or attractive your pitch deck, or how solid your business plan, it's a person's principles that set the patterns of their agreement and the actions that follow. Until the story you're telling aligns with the principles in the arguments they already agree with, it won't resonate, because it can't. The story will only resonate when the substance does, that is, when your principles and those of your audience align. What this principle means. Once you see the value of making a change, it can be hard to understand why someone else, or everyone, doesn't see that value too. But if someone doesn't see the world the way you do, They can't see the value the way you do. Without understanding the value, they have no reason to act. It's not just that your opinions are fundamentally different, it's that your outlooks on the world are fundamentally different. Their opinion will change only if their outlook changes, which is very unlikely at the primal level. You already know the bad news. Hammering someone with why you think a change makes sense from your perspective not only doesn't work, because they can neither understand nor agree, but also activates the other person's reactance. As a result, they'll usually dig in even deeper and defend their position even more passionately. The good news is that inspiring change is still possible, but only if you change your perspective to see the world their way. Once you do that, you can see which principles you share, build a case that connects those principles to the change you seek, and make an unfamiliar action align with someone else's familiar patterns. When you can find common ground in core beliefs and with them, build a bridge to the change you wish to see. You're not only respecting stakeholders' different viewpoints, but also using them as a powerful tool for effective persuasion and meaningful change. The actions that people agree with are based on beliefs they already have. To understand an action, understand the outlook that explains it. People's brains are too efficiency-oriented to waste time inventing new stories every time they need to make decisions. So instead, the brain has some go-to ingredients for building those stories: pre-existing beliefs and the principles that encode them into behavior. Change is based on story, but the stories we agree with are based on the beliefs we already have. Unfortunately, most of us are blissfully unaware of many of these core beliefs until something happens, or someone asks us to do something, or act in a way that violates one of them and creates dissonance. These kinds of hidden principles also exist at the organizational level. Professor Jim DeTert of the University of Virginia calls them the deep rules of an organization, and they too affect patterns of behavior. For example, an organization may support diversity, equity, and inclusion programs as part of its internal and external purpose and brand. However, if they decide to cut those programs due to declining revenues, it could be because of a principle they hold even more deeply: that of maximizing shareholder value. Deep beliefs are the foundations of all change because they determine the patterns for which stories, arguments, and actions someone agrees with, whether consciously or unconsciously. What someone has believed in the past almost always determines what they will believe and act on in the future, and it's their principles that set these patterns. In the words of author Antoine de Saint-Exupéry in The Little Prince, "What is essential is invisible to the eye." That's why surfacing these often silent assumptions is critical for anyone looking to foster change, whether in themselves, others, or within organizations. By bringing these core principles into the light, and by saying them in a way someone can't unhear, you can open the door to alternative outcomes and greater understanding and connect with others on a more fundamental, human level. What gets in the way? Understanding the principles that drive others' actions seems straightforward in theory, but it's often not so easy in practice. The primary obstacle? Our innate tendency to assume that others share our worldview, a cognitive bias known as the false consensus effect. This bias can lead you to overestimate the extent to which your stakeholders share your core beliefs. This shows up in all sorts of ways in the realm of decision-making and change. For instance, when proposing a change in strategy, you might assume that the logical benefits you see are also apparent to everyone else. But the people you need to carry out that change might have a completely different set of guiding principles. Those principles would lead them to prioritize different outcomes or have different risk tolerances, all shaped by their unique experiences and beliefs. The complexity of human belief systems adds another layer of difficulty. Beliefs are not just rational conclusions drawn from experiences. They are often deeply emotional and tied to a person's identity. Trying to change or challenge these beliefs can inadvertently trigger the reactance that is fatal to change. Because people can perceive your attempts as questioning a part of their very self, they may resist the change not only on principle, because it doesn't align with how they see the world, but also to protect their identity, because it doesn't align with who they see themselves to be, as you'll see in Chapter 4. Almost all negative knee-jerk reactions start as a violation of core principles. The diversity of backgrounds, experiences, and beliefs in most organizations amplifies these obstacles, making one-size-fits-all approaches to change rarely effective. As a leader, you need to navigate these varied perspectives, understand the underlying principles, and craft messages and strategies that will resonate across a spectrum of beliefs. For instance, let's say a team leader believes in the value of open communication and teamwork. The leader explains to their team that they want to put those beliefs into practice with a new collaborative work model. Sounds reasonable, right? Unfortunately, a case for change based only on open communication and teamwork principles would likely resonate only with team members who share those beliefs. For the team members who value individual achievement and autonomy more, however, the change threatens both their work style and worldview. They might see open communication as intrusive and teamwork as lessening their opportunities for individual recognition. We all want what we're used to. To maximize the likelihood that both groups would support and sustain the change, the leader could reframe the initiative and argue for it from a different perspective. They could articulate that, through the new model, the open communication and teamwork valued by one group would lead to the individual recognition and personal career growth valued by the other. Since we all want to find the best way to hit our targets this quarter, I'd like to experiment with a different way of working together. I believe we agree that the less time we spend searching for information, the more time we have to put that information to use in our work. Not to mention, the more ways you look at something, the better you can see it. That's why I want to propose a new model where we spend part of each day working in small groups, each focused on one of our team targets. Everyone would still have plenty of time for their individual work, but the team time would allow us to easily share what we've discovered on our own. We would increase and improve our individual and team's knowledge through what we learn. By aligning the new model with the team members' existing values, the leader can turn potential resistance into an opportunity for engagement and shared success, and antagonists into actives, without challenging anyone's outlook or identity. Although this may seem difficult at first, the more you actively seek to understand others' outlooks, the easier it becomes to find the principles you both share. Yes, it requires empathy, active listening, and a willingness to adapt your approach, but it can also lead you to see the diversity of human beliefs not as a barrier, but as an opportunity to forge stronger, more meaningful connections through change. Putting it into practice. The essence of inspiring change lies not merely in what you say and do, but in how both of those connect to and reflect the underlying beliefs and principles of the stakeholders involved. It's about understanding that foundational beliefs guide every decision, action, and change, both yours and theirs. And that alignment isn't automatic. So instead of imposing your outlook, work to understand theirs. When you look for, acknowledge, and respect people's deepest principles, you forge paths to agreement and action that are embraced, not enforced, which leads to meaningful change. To say something they can't unhear, begin with what they already want and believe. Thankfully, everyone has one desire: to be seen as smart, capable, and good, which is the basis of the next principle. The greatest influencer. Client who worked at a Fortune 500 company reached out to me with an intriguing dilemma. A few years before she and I met, the company had embraced a well-known sales methodology and had seen remarkable success using it to acquire new clients. But there was a catch. The same approach didn't work as well once those clients were on board. Her salespeople were getting frustrated. And so were their clients. When we use this approach to show prospective clients the value of working with us instead of a competitor, she explained, Challenging their previous decisions and assumptions makes sense and works because they see the value of the kind of insights we can provide. But when people become our clients, it doesn't make sense for us to challenge their decisions. It was our advice that drove them. She went on to say that some of the company's clients had complained of feeling challenged on everything all the time. They also sometimes felt like they weren't respected for their own industry knowledge and experience. My client was not alone in this issue, nor were these problems exclusive to the approach my client was using. What was happening? And what could the company do instead? For starters, it helps to understand that most people want to make good decisions. That's because most people share a fundamental human desire to be seen as smart, capable, and good. Done well and with the right intent, as I talked about in Chapter 1, any approach that acknowledges this smart, capable, good aspiration can be incredibly effective. When someone feels smart, capable, and good in your eyes, they often think that you must be smart, capable, and good too, simply because you see them that way. That builds the trust and confidence essential to sustained business relationships. The danger lies in how easy it can be for you to believe, often unintentionally, that another person's current course of action is rooted in ignorance and, thus, that the person can make the right decision only with the information you're providing, or that the only smart decision is your recommendation. Or, worst of all, that every other course of action is bad, and yours is the only one that's good, as if their choice were an indication of deeper character. In those cases, you may be leveraging the power of how someone wants to be seen. You may even get the initial action you're looking for, but doing so would mean ignoring the identity someone already has, even though that desired identity drives almost all of someone's decisions over time. That's why I advised my client to shift to a principles-first approach when talking with current customers. I suggested they anchor their cases for change on the agreed-upon goals of their engagements, using the insights they and their clients had reached together as the principles to support the change. That way, even when arguing for a shift in direction, the company would be reinforcing the value they and the client had gained from the relationship. What this principle means. People often quote the saying, "We are what we repeatedly do." In my experience, you can just as easily argue that we act in accordance with who we are. That's how intimate the relationship is between action and identity, and why understanding it is so fundamental to guiding change. Both statements are correct because the relationship between the two is a reinforcing loop. Identity is indeed the greatest influencer of action. Our judgments of rightness are tied so tightly to our individual and primal beliefs that they can differ as much as individuals do. We see our own beliefs as universal truths and act accordingly, using our own behavior as evidence for what the right action is, has been, and should be. The result is the mind-bending realization that people don't do what's right because it's right in some universal way, although they believe they do. When people judge what they're doing as right, they're doing so simply because they're already doing it. Their desired self-identity doesn't allow for their definition of right to be wrong in any way. In other words, the story we tell about ourselves, our narrative identity, is the most resonant and powerful story of all. In fact, the relationship between action and personal perception is so strong that people will often reinterpret past actions to align with their current sense of self. While the intricate connection between identity and action is crucial, it presents a challenge when crafting a case for change. You can't possibly tailor your message to every unique identity involved in the change process. But since almost every person aspires to be seen as smart, capable, and good, you can use that fact as a guiding principle to focus and add resonance to your approach. How? Start from the point of view that the person you're talking to is already smart, capable, and good. Even better, Reimagine how your change can reinforce and protect that identity in those you're asking to change. When your proposals and ideas about change make someone feel even more smart, capable, and good, you're respecting and validating them for who they already are. Not only does that increase their openness to new ideas, but it also contributes to their sense of current self-worth and agency, both of which make any action they undertake much more sustainable. It also avoids a battle with their desired self-identity, a battle you'll always lose in the long term. People align what they do with how they want to be seen, as smart, capable, and good. Defend that desire as strongly as they will. There's a reason leveraging the power of identity and persuasion is so effective. It's the only form of extrinsic motivation that even comes close to the power of intrinsic motivation. That said, it's also an incredibly delicate balance. When you suggest that a current method or belief is flawed, someone may say yes to your proposal in the moment, so that you'll see them as smart, capable, and good. Eventually, though, they may start to realize, even if subconsciously, that you didn't already see them that way, which can erode their faith in you as a long-term partner, or even someone worthy of trust. That's why someone who seemed eager in an initial sales meeting may later stall the sales process or back out of it entirely. It's just too hard for them to accept, even if unconsciously, that they could make a flawed decision in the first place. As the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche put it, "I did that," says my memory. "I could not have done that," says my pride, and remains inexorable. Eventually, the memory yields. Many people will respond to a perceived slight with a critique of you, the messenger, to defend their smart, capable goodness. You may have learned the hard way that criticizing someone's current perspective often results in that person telling you that you don't know them or their situation, or both, well enough to make that claim. Research shows that this shoot the messenger effect is real. People don't tend to like those who bring them bad news, especially about themselves or the decisions they've made. The deepest principle of human nature is the craving to be appreciated. William James, Letter to Students, 1896. Conversely, when you start from the perspective that the person you're talking to is already smart, capable, and good, the dynamic shifts significantly. You're much more likely to perceive and present your case as an enhancement of their existing strengths and qualities. Even when someone doesn't seem smart, capable, and good to you, asking yourself, why would a smart, capable, and good person do or think those things, can help you start to see the situation their way. This also means you're much more likely to identify what is important to them about their current course of action and ensure that your course of action continues to meet that need, even if in a different way. Both scenarios are much more likely to build trust, as well as a sense of respect and validation, all qualities that are crucial for remaining open to new ideas. Take, for instance, a marketing team leader trying to introduce a new digital strategy to their team. The team is adept at conventional marketing methods and identifies strongly with those techniques. Instead of dismissing these methods or framing the new strategy as a replacement for them, the marketing leader could acknowledge how effective the team is at reaching key stakeholder segments and position the new strategy as complementary. Like this: we need this upcoming product launch to be as successful as possible, so I want to make sure we have the best channel strategy possible. Since the more aligned our marketing is with our audience, the more effective it is. And more options for connection mean more alignment. I'd like to figure out which new marketing channel would make the most sense for us so we can connect and align with audiences we don't reach through the traditional channels we've already mastered. By tying both old and new approaches to a shared goal, helping more of the right people see the product as the right choice for them, the change becomes a way for the team to feel even more capable and effective in their roles. The leader gets both the immediate buy-in for change while also strengthening the team's confidence in and commitment to their shared identity and goals. What gets in the way? You've seen how jeopardizing the smart, capable, good aspiration can cause someone to doubt your intent. But even small nuances in how you present a change can significantly impact its resonance and how stakeholders receive or interpret it. You might think you're affirming someone's inherent smart, capable, goodness, but your honest signals, from Chapter 1, your words, tone, and even nonverbal cues may send a dissonant message if you don't truly believe that the other person is as smart, capable, and good as they believe themselves to be. This can show up when you frame these positive characteristics as conditional, suggesting in either words or manner that someone will be smart, capable, and good only if they make the change you want. But there are other, often more subtle dangers. Even when you don't directly challenge the desire of people to be seen as smart, capable, and good, not acknowledging it can still damage your efforts. For instance, simply using jargon or words someone doesn't understand can make them feel unintelligent. Presenting an incomplete argument or story about the change, see Chapter 2, makes it impossible for someone to fully understand the change or judge whether they're capable of making it, or both. Tragically, those omissions can lead to someone rejecting a change they may otherwise have accepted had they only had all the information they needed. Finally, if you leave out the deeper principles driving a change, see Chapter 3, people can't easily see if or how the change aligns with what they already consider right and good. There's yet another important point to remember. People's identities are not monolithic. While the desire to be seen as smart, capable, and good is a significant part of human identity, any individual person's identity is far more complex. This broader identity shapes how they perceive and interact with the world, influencing their reactions to new ideas and changes. The smart, capable, good aspiration is strong, but it usually isn't the only factor that affects someone's understanding of, alignment with, or agreement to a potential change. Each person has a unique narrative about who they are, shaped by their experiences, culture, and personal journey. When your message or proposal for change doesn't align with someone's personal narrative, it can create a disconnect. It's like speaking different languages. No matter how eloquent your message is, or how much it may resonate with you, it will miss the mark if it doesn't ring true to how someone wants to think about themselves. Inspiring lasting change starts with seeing and reinforcing the inherent intelligence, capability, and goodness almost everyone aspires to. That perspective can help you start to understand why and where your stakeholders might be open to doing or thinking something different, as well as what kinds of principles and beliefs would support it. But this isn't just a tactic. For winning the case for change, if you're looking for action to last, it's an essential underpinning of all your interactions. In every conversation and proposal with people whose buy-in you need for change, make sure you actively seek and affirm the smart, capable, and good qualities of their current practices and beliefs. Thanks to the strength of the smart, capable, good desire, almost any message that includes that kind of affirmation becomes a message people can't unhear. As a double check, try walking through a smart, capable, good test. Look at every element of your message, including how it's delivered and where, and ask 2 questions. 1. Does every element of the message make the stakeholder feel smart, capable, and good? And this is important, whether or not they act on the message. 2. If not, what can we do to make it so? For example, can we simplify the concepts or language? Can we remove steps in the process? Can we validate or reaffirm their experience or prior decision-making? This isn't about patting your stakeholders on the back for anything and everything they do. It's about giving people an even better story to tell themselves about themselves, one in which their identities don't have to change, even if their actions do. In fact, that last point, about changing how people behave without changing who they are, is so critical yet counterintuitive that the whole next chapter focuses on the principle that will help you understand and apply it. Are the hardest to shift. Picture a community meeting in a town where the local government has proposed a significant change in the school district's funding. The auditorium is packed with concerned parents, educators, and students, all charged with emotion about the decision's potential impacts. Unfortunately, it doesn't take long before the meeting devolves into a heated political battle. One side accuses the other of wanting to dismantle the education system, while the other counters with claims of financial mismanagement and personal self-interest. The atmosphere is tense, with each argument further entrenching the sides into their respective positions. Then, a local teacher steps up to the microphone. Instead of weighing in on the politics of the situation, they focus on the details of the policy. They talk first about the community's shared values of quality education and equal opportunities for all students. The teacher outlines why, because current classroom sizes and teacher-student ratios are hindering both of those shared values. They support the proposed shifts in funding. The tension in the room changes noticeably. Accusations and insults subside, giving way to more thoughtful and productive dialogue. Instead of questioning motive, morals, and intent, people start to engage in a productive discussion about how the shift in policy would increase individual attention to students. What happened here? How did the teacher manage to transform a heated debate between antagonists into a meaningful discussion? Consciously or not, the teacher recognized that the parents likely held beliefs even deeper than whether to change the funding. Beliefs about quality education and equal opportunity that supported the proposed changes. By shifting the conversation away from the beliefs standing in the way of progress to even stronger beliefs that could serve as starting points for change, the teacher was able to avoid attacking the opponent's identity and appeal to it instead. What this principle means. Our tendency to believe and behave consistently is both the greatest obstacle and, counterintuitively, the greatest opportunity when it comes to persuasion and change. What's more, the longer someone believes something, the stronger that belief becomes. The more someone sees that their personal principles deliver on what they want, the more they see them as true. That's why attacking someone's deep-rooted principles and positions rarely results in ready agreement and almost always triggers reactance. See Chapter 1. More often, you end up damaging the relationships required for sustainable change. But even though someone's deep-seated belief may be standing in the way of that change, something psychologists refer to as cognitive inertia, it doesn't mean that all their deep-seated beliefs do. In fact, someone may have equally strong or even stronger beliefs that, if surfaced, would support your change. When you can bring those principles into play, you can move a conversation from a conflict of identities toward more collaborative problem-solving. For example, the American Psychological Association reported on a study that focused on approaches that work to shift the degree of people's skepticism of a polarizing topic that often produces emotional, knee-jerk reactions. Climate change. The researchers found that people who were first asked how credible they found broader, less emotionally charged science, like the role of germs as a primary cause of disease or that gravity explains why objects fall when dropped, were much more likely to find climate science credible, such as rising ocean temperatures or the relationship of global warming to changed weather patterns, than those who were asked only about climate science. Even though the first group didn't completely change their minds about the existence or source of climate change, they did soften their stance on it. To use the audience categories I described in my opening note, they moved from being antagonists to being ambivalents. Substituting alternative, pre-existing beliefs like this helps you avoid triggering short-term emotional reactions in people. It also helps you tap into the beliefs that someone already sees as true because they've been internalized through years of experience. This approach turns persuasion into an exercise of exploration and alignment, where you seek out these enduring, shared beliefs and align your message with them. The longer someone has held a belief, the stronger it will be. Search for something even stronger than what's standing in the way. Why it matters. Cognitive inertia. A person's innate tendency to cling fiercely to their beliefs and the stories they tell themselves is one of the biggest challenges to change. To overcome that challenge, most conventional approaches to persuasion and influence involve either challenging limiting beliefs directly or offering new beliefs more in line with a particular change. Unfortunately, the neuroscience of human reactions works against both techniques. In the case of the first technique, challenging limiting beliefs directly, research shows that engaging in emotionally charged debates triggers people's primitive fight-or-flight responses, which can turn them into antagonists. As long as people are in that state, fighting for the positions they've attached to their identity, their brains can't consider new perspectives or question their current ones. These kinds of perceived attacks on someone's sense of self create the most dissonance of all. At that point, you have no chance of saying something they can't unhear, because in that state, they can't hear it in the first place. In the case of the second technique, trying to convince someone to want or believe something new, your main enemy is still cognitive inertia. How can that be? Think about it. In the face of long and strongly held beliefs, new beliefs face an uphill battle both ways. It's hard for new beliefs to gain traction with people, usually because they already have a pre-existing belief that explains their current thinking and behavior. Also, new beliefs, no matter how logical or beneficial they may seem, lack the weight of history and experience, unlike the beliefs people already have. That weakness makes new beliefs inherently less compelling and much more easily dismissed. How our pasts define our presents. All those dominoes of influence that we don't begin to acknowledge as part of defining who we are. Elizabeth George, A Traitor to Memory, 2001. But consider what happened in the climate skepticism study I mentioned earlier. By activating equally strong or stronger beliefs in people, such as germs cause disease and gravity makes things fall, the researchers were using the cognitive inertia of those deeper, stronger beliefs to disrupt the others. They made cognitive inertia work for them, not against them. While the deepest beliefs are the hardest to shift, they can be the best candidates for beliefs supporting your change. Ultimately, the art and science of enduring change lies not in challenging entrenched beliefs, but in harnessing their existing power. Instead of searching out the weak points of someone's beliefs or position, search for the stronger beliefs you share and base your case on them instead. When you do, you create a sense of collaboration and continuity, which allows people to see a change as a natural extension of what they already know or believe to be true. Even better, they may begin to see you as someone they can trust to help get them there, rather than as an obstacle to overcome. What gets in the way? In many ways, your understanding of this principle helps you avoid some of the most common pitfalls of change. As in the teacher's approach in the community meeting, when your approach to change incorporates ingrained beliefs instead of antagonizing them, you're more likely to avoid activating the negative, knee-jerk responses that arise from perceived threats to someone's agency and identity. Because these beliefs are already part of the stories people tell themselves, you also rarely, if ever, need to explain or argue for them. They're already a well-established part of how someone sees the world. In fact, researchers at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem found that people's brains process opinions they agree with the same way they do facts. All of that said, it's easy to slip back into battle positions, especially if previous conversations about a change have been emotionally charged. With that kind of fraught history, it can be easy to use those shared perspectives against someone. Going back to the community meeting about school funding, the teacher would likely not have been successful if they had said something like, You said you believed in the importance of education. If that's really true, you would support these changes. That kind of framing can violate people's desire to be seen as smart, capable, and good, which creates the kind of dissonance that can call your intent into question. When you're faced with strong opposition or deeply ingrained viewpoints, it can help to focus your aim on learning instead of winning. Only through your curiosity and openness to someone else's viewpoint will you be able to spot the points where you and your stakeholders align. Once you've discovered a shared and supporting belief, present it simply as your belief and incorporate it into your own argument for change. To go back to our community meeting again, the teacher's successful remarks would have sounded something like this. I believe that every child deserves an education that prepares them for the future. And the more attention each child receives, the better prepared they can be. That's why I support adjusting the funding. It allows us to reduce class sizes and spend more time with each student. The teacher outlined their internal argument for the change using the shared belief they know about, and another belief that they perceived the other group members would agree with too. This approach helps stakeholders better understand the principles behind your position, allowing them to see the thread that connects shared beliefs to a change. It also preserves their agency, as once people understand the argument and the principles on which it's based, it's up to them to decide whether they agree. More on that in Chapter 8. If the supporting beliefs are strong enough, they're more likely to adopt the same story and the same change. Putting it into practice. The essential takeaway is this: don't challenge beliefs, exchange them. When you identify and empower beliefs that are as strong or stronger than those opposing a change, you lay an equally strong foundation for new behaviors or perspectives. You also transform the process of change from a confrontation into a collaboration. Instead of proving someone wrong or dismantling their framework of understanding, you're connecting and building on deeply held principles you share. Finally, and most importantly, you're creating a path to change that reduces or removes as much discomfort, difficulty, and dissonance as possible. Why is that important? Because long-term pain is the biggest obstacle of all to long-term change, as you'll see in the next principle. Enemy of long-term change. You've ever tried to cut back on sugar, you might have faced a challenge like this. Let's say your favorite indulgence is a 30-ounce iced coffee smoothie with whipped cream and extra caramel. Each time you have one, it serves as a sweet, sacred escape from all that ails you. The problem? You escape 3 times a day. After a routine doctor's visit brings concerning news about your sugar intake, you decide to quit these sugary delights cold turkey. You stay strong through the first few days, even though cravings gnaw at you. But it doesn't take long before every coffee shop you pass whispers of the creamy, caffeinated comfort you're missing. Despite your initial resolve, the pain of the change becomes too much. You decide to cheat with just one, but that opens the floodgates of longing. The routine of your familiar habit beckons, and soon you're back to enjoying succulent smoothies, albeit with a tinge of guilt. So, what went wrong? Although your intentions were admirable, you overlooked the fact that you, like all humans, are a creature of deeply ingrained habit. It wasn't just the sugar you missed, it was the entire experience, the ritual, the comfort, the brief respite that the drink provided. Since, as a human, you're also wired to avoid loss, losing out on so much at once represented a deeply disruptive and painful change to your day. It also represented a deeply disruptive and painful change to your whole identity. As you no doubt have guessed, this scenario isn't just about a sugary drink. It's a common thread in our attempts to make changes in our lives. We often focus solely on the goal, not thinking about the discomfort and resistance that the journey to get there might entail. But when it comes to making change stick, how you change is often as important as what you change. The key is to limit, reduce, or even avoid pain altogether whenever and however you can. What this principle means. Think about pain for a minute. How did you learn not to touch a hot stove? By touching it, right? And did you keep touching it? No, because it hurt. If doing something feels like a constant struggle or an assault on your sense of self, if it's painful, it's only a matter of time before you abandon it. Ask anyone who's tried hyper-restrictive diets, like Whole30, or uber-strict exercise programs, like 75 Hard. That's especially true if a change is dissonant with or undermines your desired smart, capable, and good self-image. When a change makes you feel otherwise, it's not just painful, it's also unsustainable. Pain, whether emotional, physical, or psychological, is something we humans naturally seek to avoid. This instinct is crucial to remember when you want to inspire lasting change in others or yourself. Painful changes, no matter how beneficial or good they may seem, rarely stick. Why? Because sticking with an action that continually causes discomfort goes against your basic human nature. However, it's important to distinguish between painful behaviors and harmful ones. Many of us have sustained harmful behaviors, such as I did with smoking and eating over months or years. Those behaviors may hurt you, but unless you feel that hurt, you usually don't stop them. It's only when something about the behavior becomes too painful, as it might if the behavior put a more important identity you have, like keeping my kids safe and healthy, at risk, that you are driven to stop it. But let's go back to those sugary drinks. An abrupt, all-or-nothing approach to cutting out a favorite treat too often ends up as the nothing part of that equation, leading you to abandon the change entirely. The emotional and psychological discomfort is both more immediate and more uncomfortable than the distant pleasure that may come from a positive report from your doctor. Because you're wired to stop the pain, you'll eventually stop what's creating it, and the change you were hoping for. Thankfully, the solution is in the problem. The less painful a change is, the more sustainable it is. When you're working to create change with others, the more you reframe a change to reduce emotional, mental, and, where appropriate, physical pain, the more the change will align with a person's inherent desire for stability and well-being. This doesn't mean you can avoid or even eliminate all discomfort or effort. No matter how much you work to reduce the pain of a change, it's always going to require effort to shift thinking or behavior. But discomfort and effort are different from pain in that people are willing to tolerate both, or either, even over time, if they consider the outcome worthy enough. Just ask your marathon running friend. That said, the more you can reduce that effort, or the discomfort someone might feel mentally or emotionally as a result, the easier the change will be. How do you put this principle to work in the real world? Reduce the scale of the actions you ask for so that they're below the threshold of pain, so that the steps required to make the change don't feel dissonant with someone's normal behaviors or daily life. With your coffee habit, for example, you might cut back to the 20-ounce size or stick with the 30-ounce but have only 2 a day instead of 3. If it's a stakeholder's actions you need, test every proposed change with questions like, is this action sustainable for them? Can they do it without a constant struggle? When you pursue changes that respect the existing habits and beliefs of the people you're trying to influence and avoid creating continuous discomfort, even transformational change becomes both possible and sustainable. You're also much more likely to craft a case that's grounded in the empathy and understanding that help build the base of lasting change. Humans are wired to avoid pain, both in the moment and over time. Ask for the largest action that's easiest for stakeholders to sustain. People are more likely to adopt behaviors that are in line with their previous actions and beliefs, thanks to what's known as behavioral consistency. When you're trying to inspire change in others, understanding behavioral consistency can make all the difference. It explains why people revert to past actions and lays the groundwork for how to make a proposed change feel like a natural and painless extension of what someone is already doing. Much as people are more likely to accept a change based on pre-existing beliefs, they're also more likely to make the change if it's based on pre-existing behaviors. Imagine you're leading a team through an organizational change. If a new process you introduce seems like a small step from current practices, your team is less likely to reject it and much more likely to attempt it. Yes, it may take you longer to implement the full scope of change, but once made, the team will likely stick with it longer as a result. Now, let's say the change you need is significant. Breaking it down into smaller, more comfortable steps can ease the transition. For instance, let's revisit our marketing team leader from Chapter 4, the one who wanted to introduce a new digital strategy. Completely converting to an all-digital approach all at once would surely antagonize the team members who are used to more traditional channels. However, introducing channels that play to the team's traditional marketing strengths, one at a time, would allow the team time to feel more confident as they build up a new set of skills. Much like grounding a change in pre-existing behaviors makes cognitive inertia work for you, this approach works because it makes behavioral consistency work for you. You're working with natural human tendencies, not against them. Ultimately, this principle helps explain what can turn an initial yes to a change into a no over time. Saying yes initially may have relieved the person's pain for the moment, but if sustaining that yes meant sustaining a different kind of pain long-term, their drive to avoid pain would lead them to abandon the change. What gets in the way? A lot of advice about persuasion and influence focuses on creating pain or discomfort for the person you're trying to persuade. Although pain may be the ally of quick action, it gets people to move and often to move quickly. No human will continue to do something long-term that feels emotionally, physically, or mentally painful to them. Eventually, all their attention turns to stopping the pain, leaving them incapable of acting in favor of anything else. Nothing is so painful to the human mind as a great and sudden change. Mary Shelley, Frankenstein. That's why, all too often, the levers people pull to persuade in the moment, especially those that violate the smart, capable, good aspiration, are the same ones that ensure action won't last. However effective leveraging pain might be in the short term, if you've used a form of pain that endures, like that of asking someone to act against their deep-seated beliefs, or from being made to act without understanding why, you've unwittingly planted the seeds for undoing it. But sometimes, even when you break a change down into the smallest of baby steps, people still resist it. Why? Because the effort-to-outcome ratio, or ETO, is off. ETO is my term for describing the relationship between how much work something requires and the result it produces. As the one framing a change, the challenge for you is this: you don't get to decide what an acceptable ETO is for someone. Only they do. What might seem to you to be a perfectly reasonable amount of effort to achieve a goal or change might feel overwhelming to someone else. You might be willing to work long hours to land a big deal or make your startup a success, for instance, but your team may not. Your best hope in that situation is to search for an outcome your stakeholders value enough to make the effort worth it. If you only want short-term action or results, by all means, bring the pain, if that aligns with your beliefs and values. But if your goals require longer-lasting change, instead of introducing pain, try reducing it. The lower the level of discomfort a potential change creates, the higher the probability of long-term success. This doesn't mean resorting to a rose-colored glasses view of change, nor does it mean not talking about the pain someone may be experiencing in their current situation. Acknowledging someone's pain and its reasons can establish credibility and rapport. But there's a big difference between describing the pain someone else is already experiencing and leveraging the pain you created to persuade that person to act. Leveraging pain in that way may not only crush someone personally, but also crush your hoped-for change. Adjusting the actions you're asking for doesn't diminish the significance or scale of the change. By reducing the pain of change, you reduce dissonance and make it easier for people to take the first steps toward change and stay the course long term. However, there is one form of discomfort that's critical for creating the conditions for change: the inner conflict people feel when two of their truths conflict with each other. We'll explore this further in the next chapter. When two. I love a beautifully styled bed with layers upon layers of pillows, quilts, and throws. I also love a consistently made bed because what's the point of all those gorgeous, fluffy layers if they're left in a crumpled heap? Any effort required to make the bed is worth the pleasure I get whenever I see it. It's an almost meditative practice. Not so for my husband. While he appreciated the luxury hotel look I was attempting a few years ago, even I had to admit that it was at odds with the reality of our daily life. More often than not, in the rush to get up and out for the day, we were lucky to just get the bed covered. It was a battle between what I loved in theory and what we lived in practice. That left me with a choice. Was it more important to have a beautifully styled bed or a made one? The made bed won out. So, we decided to go full European, and now making the bed is as simple as floating a lovely linen duvet over the mattress and fluffing a couple of pillows. Bed-making success rates in our household skyrocketed overnight. But this isn't just a story of pursuing domestic and decorating bliss. It's a lesson in how lasting change happens. Reducing choices to a conflict between the core values they represent, which creates the right kind of dissonance in just the right amount, makes it easier for someone to decide what they ultimately value more. In my bed-making scenario, the battle was between style and practicality won. It's these kinds of daily, value-driven decisions that set the stage for larger, more enduring changes in our lives. What this principle means. All change involves choice. Sometimes that choice is between two things someone deeply believes or values. That kind of choice creates the specific form of mental pain I first mentioned in Chapter 1, cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the discomfort someone feels when conflicting beliefs or desires challenge their current understanding of the world, when the ding of truth makes their previous perspective feel out of tune with what they want or who they want to be. Cognitive dissonance is also incredibly powerful. As soon as someone feels the discomfort a conflict of truths creates, their brain will quickly choose one of them to make the discomfort disappear. When two truths fight, only one wins. Aristotle understood this concept, although he called it by another name, anagnorisis, a moment of critical discovery or recognition. For the philosopher, that dissonance-creating moment was essential to structuring every story of transformation. For anyone trying to inspire change, it's also essential to the stories people tell themselves. Cognitive dissonance is our modern-day anagnorisis, the moment someone confronts their beliefs and must choose between them. But the moment usually happens so quickly that the choice is neither conscious nor rational. People make decisions based on what feels most right in the moment, which in reality is what feels most in line with the identity they aspire to and the principles that set the patterns of their behavior. See chapters 3 and 4. Because cognitive dissonance is the mental spark that turns contemplation into action, creating it is a requirement for instigating long-term change. That may seem to violate the previous principle, where pain is the enemy, but this is one of the few scenarios where pain is, indeed, your ally. That's because the pain of cognitive dissonance is like a pinprick, sharp but fleeting. Once a person decides and resolves the dissonance, the pain dissolves. What's more, the pain of cognitive dissonance and the decision that resolves it don't erode someone's identity, they clarify it. Change requires choice. In a battle of beliefs, the strongest source of self survives. F. Scott Fitzgerald once noted, "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." That's true, as long as the two ideas are kept fairly far apart from one another. But when put head-to-head, one idea is inevitably stronger. One of the best examples of this at the market level is the De Beers "A Diamond is Forever" campaign from 1947. Prior to De Beers's new slogan, "A simple metal ring, a circle with no beginning and no end," was considered the ultimate symbol of forever. However, when the brand aligned diamond rings with the idea of an endless commitment, they created cognitive dissonance. The conflict wasn't just choosing between two types of rings. It was also about the degree of forever the choice would represent, and the conflict of beliefs and values that ensued. History tells us which idea won. For many couples, a diamond is still the best symbol of forever. The example of the teacher at the community meeting in Chapter 5 also shows this principle at play. For the people who opposed the changes in school funding, the teacher's case for change would likely create some level of dissonance. If, like the teacher, that person believed A, every child deserves an education that prepares them for the future, B, more individual attention leads to a better education, and C, the funding will reduce class sizes, then their previous stance would conflict with one of these beliefs. Remember, dissonance requires resolution. By anchoring deep-seated positions in a structure that pitted them against their anti-funding position, the teacher raised the probability that the dissonance would resolve in favor of the funding change. That doesn't mean resolving dissonance is easy. The more two ideas represent someone's deepest desires and values, the more difficult the choice between them can be. In her TED talk, philosopher and professor Dr. Ruth Chang suggests that what someone decides in these moments says less about the options and more about the person themselves. But it's through these tough choices that someone can exercise their agency and determine what they value most. This is why understanding and carefully creating cognitive dissonance is so crucial. Change doesn't happen without it. The art of using cognitive dissonance successfully, however, lies in framing your argument's assumptions in a way that naturally aligns the desired change with someone's deeper values and identity. Rather than forcing a change, your framing helps people see which choice truly resonates most with who they are. In the end, it's these value-driven choices that create long-term changes that stick. What gets in the way? Humans are delightful hypocrites. We say one thing, do another, and then side-eye someone else doing the exact same thing. This hypocrisy sheds light on a fascinating aspect of our nature. Our values can shift depending on the context, just as a chameleon blends into its surroundings. One minute, we're the punctual professional. The next, we're the fashionably late friend. So the universe is not quite as you thought it was. You'd better rearrange your beliefs then, because you certainly can't rearrange the universe. Dr. Matt Grawich, a professor at St. Louis University, explains that people have two kinds of values: personal and relational. Personal values are the principles we hold dear, setting the patterns of our behavior and forming the core of our belief system. They're the bedrock of our identity, shaping our decisions and providing a sense of direction. They're also the strongest foundation for making your case for change to someone else, which was what Chapter 3 was all about. Then there are relational values, which shape the nature of our relationships and social connections, and determine our needs for belonging, respect, and understanding in our interactions. Not only do personal and relational values differ from person to person, but also the individual weight someone assigns to them differs depending on the situation, as do the actions that result. For example, someone may consider honesty is the best policy to be an absolute rule at work, but when it comes to getting out of a dreaded social engagement, well, a white lie doesn't really hurt, does it? This gets even trickier when you realize that people usually aren't even aware of their own chameleonic nature and the situational hypocrisy it creates. They might not realize that what is crucial to them in one context becomes trivial in another. When your case for change surfaces the hidden assumptions that drive actions, you shed light on values people may not have realized were in play or in conflict. But your task is not to explicitly point out someone's inconsistencies. People don't like to be called hypocrites, as it violates their desired smart, capable, and good identities and turns you into a messenger they'd like to shoot. Using the hypocrite label is a sure path to activating resistance and reactance. Rather, your task is to remain aware that people's personal and relational values can and do shift. It's why anchoring your argument in your and your stakeholders' strongest, deepest, core beliefs about the world, see chapters 3 and 5, is often your best, if not only, option. Despite these challenges, applying this principle can help you unlock a potent force for change. Even when values shift and render your argument less resonant than you'd hoped, people's innate need to close the gaps in their beliefs can reveal crucial insights into why someone could be open to change, or if they ever will be. When you understand and respect these fluid values and craft messages that align with them, you can guide change without triggering resistance. It's not always easy, but it can be transformative. Even in professional and organizational contexts, sustainable change is a personal journey, one that hinges on the individual's battle of beliefs. Your task is to craft narratives that bring these inner conflicts to the fore. But once they do, only the other person can decide which desires or beliefs win out. Offer them your arguments and align them with your shared values, but respect their agency and right to deliberate and decide. When the path to change aligns closely with their core self, that's when change sticks. As you'll discover with the next principle, your job is simply to show, not lead, the way. Want it more than they do. All you want to do is cancel your cable service. You pick up the phone, dial the number, and brace yourself for the inevitable. The customer service representative answers, and upon hearing your request, switches into high gear. They start pitching every imaginable package, deal, and special offer. It's a relentless barrage of benefits, each more extravagant than the last. What if I tell you we can throw in premium channels at no extra cost for 3 months? They offer, with a hint of desperation. You decline. How about a special bundle with internet and phone? Still, no. The offers keep coming, each sounding like the deal of a lifetime. But no matter how much they benefit bomb you or how shiny or tempting the packages, they all miss one crucial point. You understand their offers perfectly. You just don't want them. Once the representative made their case clear, their ability to influence your decision was over, if, that is, they ever had a chance at all. What this principle means. Likely, you've been in both positions. You've been the customer, nodding along with no intention of buying, if you were feeling nice that day. You've also been the over-eager salesperson bombarding someone with benefits or repeating the same case for change, but louder, to no effect. While you can and should make sure your stakeholders understand your case for change, your job is over once they do. It's one of the hardest lessons of inspiring change, but one of the most important. You can't want to change more than the person you're presenting it to. Change is all about alignment. It happens only when someone believes that a change will give them something they want via a set of means they believe in. Only by outlining how and why a change achieves an outcome that someone already wants can you determine whether they're ever likely to change at all. For example, if they care about convenience and you're focused on innovation, your job is to show how your innovation can enhance their convenience in a way that aligns with what they want and believe about themselves. If you can't make a legitimate connection between the change you want and an outcome someone truly cares about. And I really can't emphasize this enough. They will not make the change on their own. To use the categories of people I introduced at the beginning of this book, only actives and ambivalents, once they convince themselves, are the owners of lasting change, because they are the only ones who truly desire the outcome it provides. You can lay out your best arguments, present the most compelling evidence, and appeal to their highest ideals. But if the other person's desire doesn't naturally align with what you're offering, the change won't last, if it ever happens at all. This misalignment isn't merely ineffective, it's counterproductive. It builds resistance, not rapport. For all the reasons I've talked about, starting in Chapter 1, you can't make someone agree with your argument. If, despite your best efforts, your case doesn't resonate with someone or they remain neutral to it, accepting that decision doesn't mean that you accept defeat. Your acceptance of their decision is your acknowledgement of both their agency and their smart, capable, and good self-identity. When you accept and step back, you offer them space and time to reconsider on their own terms what they've heard and what they can't unhear, all free from the pressure that might otherwise trigger reactance. Stepping back also gives you the space and time to determine if and how it's worth trying again. In other words, desire can overcome any objection, but yours is no substitute for theirs. You can only influence understanding. Why it matters. All stories start with desire. In traditional once-upon-a-time stories, the action starts when the audience or reader discovers what the main character wants but doesn't yet have. The same is true in the stories someone tells themselves, where they are the main character. They know how they want the story to end, with getting the object of their desires and the benefits they think that will bring. But they don't know how to make that happy ending happen. That's where your change comes in. To say something people can't unhear, anchor it in something they won't unwant. That is, something they are unlikely to ignore or reject later. Because people are already interested in and internally motivated to act on what they want, they are constantly attuned to any information that will successfully fill in the missing chapters and tell them what they need to do to get there. That's why it's so important to clearly link a change to something someone actively and knowingly seeks. When you don't, the change stops before it ever starts. Given a choice, it's also a lot harder for someone to say no to what they already want or have than to say no to what is new, like a change they didn't ask for. A person's desires are part of their identity and drive many of their current and past behaviors. But they have no history with something they've never seen or heard of before, and thus no way to know if it fits with who they are. This is precisely why presenting a change without a mutually desired outcome is a sure path to struggle or failure. Here's a grim reality. 35% of startups fail because there was no market need for what the startup was selling. The startups presented the change, but not the current desire it satisfied. As a result, people didn't want what the company offered, or at least they didn't think they did. But this issue isn't exclusive to startups. I've seen it in every size and kind of business. People often get so invested in their own desire for a change that they assume everyone else will want it too, and for the same reasons. It's yet another reason why author and TED speaker Simon Sinek's advice to start with why is so important, especially when it comes to crafting a case for change. By articulating what your change delivers, you're making it crystal clear why you want that change, and why your stakeholders might too. But if others don't act on the change, even when you've stated a why they agree with, it's likely because they have something else: routine, balance, safety, etc. They want even more. This is why distinguishing the states of desire I described in the opening note is critical. The indifferents don't want or care about your change and probably never will, at least not in the time you have available to try to convince them. The antagonists may even be actively working against it. In both cases, the effort to outcome ratio probably isn't worth it for you or them. Surprisingly, the same is true for the actives, but for the opposite reason. They're already converted, so you don't need to preach. Since actives already have the desire and motivation, you need to help them know what to do and make them feel confident that your answer will deliver. You can even equip them with the arguments that will help them advocate for the change with others. That leaves you with the ambivalence. Often, these individuals represent the biggest group in times of major change, because that's when true ambivalence, dissonance, is most common. Ambivalents have the desire you need, but another thing they want is pulling them equally hard in a different direction. Your job is to activate whichever of their pre-existing desires and beliefs would tip the balance in a new direction. Yours. When there's a battle for change, it's won or lost with the ambivalence. Enlist the actives in your cause. Expect the indifference to go along. Just don't expect them to be excited about it. And convert or neutralize the antagonists when you can. Understanding where your stakeholders currently stand helps you focus your efforts where they're most likely to work best. What gets in the way? No surprise here, benefit bombing tops the list of the most common pitfalls. Benefit bombing is when, once you've established the link between your change and an actively desired outcome, you list every advantage and feature of your idea, hoping something will spark that desire you know you need. But if you list 17 possible desires, you've started 17 stories that will need 17 valid and sound arguments that lead to a happy ending. That's not just difficult. It's also dangerous to your change. In his TED Talk, organizational psychologist Niro Sivanathan warns of the dilution effect. He explains, when you introduce irrelevant or even weak arguments, those weak arguments reduce the weight of your overall argument. Don't miss what this means. Your case for change will sink to the level of its weakest point. To make matters worse, you don't get to judge where that weakness lies. Your audience does. That's not all. Promising that your change can slice, dice, and fold someone's laundry often comes across as disingenuous or even dishonest. People just don't believe it's possible, based on too many other times that someone has overpromised and underdelivered. But people also find benefit bombing overwhelming, which leaves them unclear about what's truly relevant to them. In other situations, they could be perfectly clear about what's relevant, but find all the angles and options confusing, distracting, or even unnecessary. They're left thinking, what's all this got to do with me? Why would I want all those things when I'm happy with this one thing? And sometimes they're wondering, just how much are all those extras going to cost me? For example, one of my clients is a startup that makes autonomous robots for farmers. Its initial products were loaded with the most advanced features, including AI-assisted mapping and resource planning. Despite the innovations, the company struggled to gain traction because the farmers simply didn't need all the extra features. The added complexity not only drove up costs, but also made the robots more difficult for farm workers to use, defeating the whole purpose of the robots in the first place. A no uttered from the deepest conviction is better than a yes merely uttered to please. So, the startup made a transformational decision. It stripped the robot down to its essentials and focused solely on what the farmers truly needed: a straightforward, functional, and easy-to-use tool for a labor-intensive process. This shift made the product not only more accessible and affordable, but also more aligned with the market's demands. The result? The startup began to see a significant uptick in interest. By cutting out the extras and homing in on the primary need, the company found its sweet spot in the market and a potential path to changing the future of farming. Your stakeholders neither need nor want a puzzle to piece together when it comes to change. Instead, they need a focused narrative that directly connects with their interests. Providing that narrative requires replacing the forces keeping them from changing with ones that sustain the change. That means highlighting benefits that genuinely align with their interests and needs rather than offering a laundry list of features. Focusing on the true drivers behind your approach may even alter the scale or scope of your change. As I say to my clients, you can only have one front door. When you give people too many options, they often don't choose any of them. Instead of trying to convince them with all possible features or benefits, determine their desire and align with that. Putting it into practice. When applying this principle, borrow a concept from market research. Remove the neutral position. Sometimes it's important to know where people stand on an issue, when indifference or ambivalence isn't an option. This is why researchers will remove the neutral choice from a set of multiple choice answers. For example, the option that follows slightly agree is slightly disagree, not neither agree nor disagree. You can remove the neutral position for your change by framing your message as the response to an urgent or important question your stakeholders actively want answered. My startup client, for instance, might say, "Our simple and easy-to-use robots help you close the gap between the work you have to do and the workers you have." If you're a farmer who knowingly and actively wants to close that gap, you'll stay tuned for the rest of the story. If you're not a prospect for the startup and likely will never be. And that's okay. Knowing that, the startup can spend more time on the people who are. When you show how a change can legitimately solve a problem someone actively wants to resolve or meet a desire they already know they have, your audience can't remain indifferent to it. But if you want it more than they do, your best option is walking away. Only when stakeholders want to change as much as or more than you do will they have developed the intrinsic motivation that will make the change last. Enduring action is the product of this kind of active desire and someone's beliefs about it. But one belief in particular leads to lasting change: the belief that the change is right, which we'll cover in the final principle. There's 1,000 songs in your pocket. 2 great tastes that taste great together. A Jaws in space. Do any of those sound familiar? The first is how Steve Jobs famously introduced the Apple iPod in 2001. The second is the 1970s and 80s tagline for Reese's peanut butter cups. The 2 great tastes, being chocolate and peanut butter. The third is how director and screenwriter Dan O'Bannon pitched what became the sci-fi thriller Alien to movie studios. What do you notice about each of them? They don't just introduce something new or new to you. They explain it using elements you already know. If you were the ideal audience for these products, you also already wanted or valued those elements. Each message has generated billions of dollars for the products they sold by making something unfamiliar feel familiar. Since change is all about doing or thinking the unfamiliar, the more you understand how to create this fusion of familiar elements, the more agreeable and effective your change communications will be. If you've ever impulsively clicked the buy button and later wondered, "What was I thinking?" you've experienced buyer's remorse. It's most common after hasty decisions or impulse purchases spurred on by excitement, pressure, or even coercion. You're not sure the decision is right, but it might be. Either way, you probably feel that the risk of being wrong or being perceived as wrong is too great. So, you take a leap of faith and say yes to something in the moment only to regret the decision later, sometimes even immediately. But there's no such thing as believer's remorse. If someone believes their decision was right, and if it continues to resonate with who they want to be and how they see themselves, they won't regret the decision itself. That holds true even when a change is difficult to make or implement, or doesn't achieve the outcome someone hoped for. So how can you help make a change feel right to someone else? You already know some of the requirements. A change needs to satisfy someone's internal story. It must be consistent with their deep-seated beliefs and identity. It must be the result of a decision a person makes with full agency and control, even if they lack complete knowledge or confidence. One additional requirement for making a change feel right for someone is to ensure it makes sense to them in the first place. To do that, it helps to understand what happens in someone's brain when they hear or see new information. Their brain's first step is to try to connect that information to something they already know. The more the new information connects with prior knowledge or learning, the more likely understanding will follow. The more someone understands, the more obvious the points of alignment become. And the more the change aligns with what someone wants and believes, the more likely they'll be to make it. When O'Bannon pitched Alien, he was unknown as a writer. For the studios he was pitching to, risking $10 million on the script required a giant leap of faith. As with other kinds of leaps, the larger it is, the likelier it is to fall short, especially if it doesn't spring from a stable source. As you saw in Chapter 6, the bigger the yes you're asking for, the more likely it is that you'll get a no. But O'Bannon's pitch reduced that risk by attaching the idea of his new movie to two other films, Jaws and Star Wars, that studio executives knew to have been incredibly popular and profitable. 4 years earlier, Jaws had become the highest-grossing film of all time. 2 years later, Star Wars surpassed it. Just as each scene builds the story in a book, movie, or play, each of the Jaws and in-space parts of O'Bannon's pitch built the case for his idea and how it would deliver the financial return the producers wanted. Alien went on to become the fifth highest-grossing movie in the year it was released, and the start of what has become the highest-grossing horror movie franchise in history. The lesson these three examples teach is that change communication or selling an idea isn't about persuading others to jump blindly. It's a process of leading people, step by step, through a narrative they already know, like, and trust, along a path to your new idea. Rather than one big yes, you secure a series of what my friend, author, and human connection expert Tim David calls little yeses, each serving as permission to proceed. Not only do those yeses give your audience more control, lessening the chance they'll reject the change now or regret their agreement later, but they also tell you if and where your stakeholders don't understand or agree, saving everyone a lot of time, money, and regret. People don't regret the decisions they believe are right. Instead of asking for leaps of faith, build bridges of belief. If a person doesn't understand the change you're presenting, they won't act on it, at least not for long. The more that any new information you introduce aligns with what a person already knows, the more likely it is that both the case for change and the change itself will make more sense. In writing and rhetoric, the technique for aligning new information with what someone already knows is commonly called the known new contract, after a theory originally developed by two researchers, Herbert H. Clark and Susan E. Haviland, who studied the connection between language and psychological processes. To use the technique in your own communication, start with something the stakeholder already knows, and then link that information to a new piece of information. That new information becomes known, which means you can then link it to another new piece of information. By familiarizing the unfamiliar for your stakeholders, this technique encourages genuine interest and commitment, making every step toward the change feel smaller and less risky. Your stakeholders can rely on their own knowledge and experience, not just on your assurances, to validate your case for change. They've said yes to some of the pieces before, which makes saying yes to the whole much, much easier. Think back to the teacher's case from the community meeting in Chapter 5, which went like this. I believe that every child deserves an education that prepares them for the future, and the more attention each child receives, the better prepared they can be. That's why I support adjusting the funding. It allows us to reduce class sizes and spend more time with each student. Do you see the known new pattern in play here? Because the teacher used principles the meeting attendees were likely to share, see Chapter 3. The two beliefs served as the known information, and the change was the new conclusion they drew from it. In your own cases for change, think of creating 1,000 little Yeses. As I noted earlier, the little yeses part comes from Tim David. I added the word thousand to create a strategy that aligns perfectly with this book's underlying theme, building a long-term case for change on a foundation of shared beliefs and desires. But what exactly are these 1,000 little yeses? They are the answers to questions raised by each element of an argument for change. When the teacher introduced their argument with, "I believe that every child deserves an education that prepares them for the future," it raised an implicit question in the minds of the attendees. Do I agree? If they answered yes, even unconsciously, they would keep listening until another similar checkpoint arises. Teacher. The more attention each child receives, the better prepared they can be. Audience, internally. Do I agree? Yes. Ding. Teacher. That's why I support adjusting the funding. It allows us to reduce class sizes and spend more time with each student. Audience, internally. Do I agree? Yes. Ding. Although this is a brief example, the phenomenon of the 1,000 little yeses holds true no matter how long your process of inspiring change may last. That's not only because it activates someone's agency, which helps avoid reactance, but also because it helps articulate another equally important type of why, the reasoning behind your how. In the last chapter, you saw how starting with the why behind the what of your change helps you remove the neutral position for your stakeholders. By anchoring your case for change on an outcome both you and your stakeholders want and consider important, you not only start the story engines in the stakeholders' minds, but also get the first of your 1,000 yeses. Do you want an answer to this question? Yes. However, aligning with your audience only on the outcome of a change often isn't enough to sustain the change long-term, or even to get it started. As you saw in Chapter 6, lasting change requires that you and your audience align both on the desired outcome of a change and on the approach to achieving it. As you saw in Chapter 3, to align on the outcome of and approach to a change, you and your audience must also align on the principles both of those are based on the why behind both the what and the how. Imagine you're a leader charged with increasing innovation in your company so that you can stay ahead of the competition and develop new revenue streams. You and other senior leaders have decided that the best way to achieve those outcomes is to set up a separate innovation lab that operates independently to cultivate new ideas. Because innovation is a core value of your organization, you feel confident your team will enthusiastically agree with the change and help you implement it. Excited to get started, you call the team together and make the announcement. Today, I'm excited to announce that we're going to create the Innovation Incubator, an independent ideation lab that will develop and cultivate new ideas and help us achieve our goals for increasing innovation. You look around, eagerly. Unfortunately, instead of the excitement you were expecting, your team seems angry. What was that line from Hemingway? What's right is what feels good after. I thought innovation was a core value of this company. It's why I came here, and now you're telling me that it's no longer part of my job? If this is what this company thinks innovation is all about, I'm out of here. Don't you believe this team is capable of innovation ourselves? Uh-oh. Despite your good intentions, it's clear your team is upset. These aren't the actives you expected. They're antagonists, ready to reject the change and even the company itself. You can't control their reaction now that you've made the announcement, but you can see how you contributed to it. Even though you and your team agree on the why of increasing innovation, that agreement alone wasn't enough to overcome their disagreement on the how. You need a different approach, and fast. But what? You're not the kind of manager who tells your team to just get over it. Nor are you the kind of manager who will force the change through when your team is so clearly upset by it. Past experience has taught you that taking either of those approaches would eliminate any possibility of progress. So, you reassure your team that the decision isn't final, explain that your intention was to involve them as early as possible, and apologize for taking them by surprise. And yet, you still need to increase innovation. So how can you get them on board? Just as you're about to list all the features and benefits of the incubator to convince your team, whiteboard walls, free snacks, beanbag chairs, you remember, every decision has a story. So, instead of benefit bombing, you back up and explain why the incubator makes sense to you. I agree that innovation is a core value of this organization. You all even helped build our company's definition of it. In fact, the definition is where the leadership team started our process, even though I know I didn't start there just now. Let me try again. At this company, we believe that innovation is the process of implementing new ideas that add value to the organization. The leadership team also believes that fewer interruptions lead to more ideas. But unfortunately, our open plan office makes interruptions all too easy. That's why we thought creating an environment that facilitates focus would help us generate more ideas and increase innovation. Hearing the complete argument, which adds the why, fewer interruptions behind the how, independent incubator, makes the previously implicit assumptions explicit. That helps the employees understand how the leaders arrived at their idea and why it makes sense to them. What's more, thanks to the rules of logic and our minds, if the employees agree with the leader's assumptions, they will agree with the leader's idea as well. Principles are almost always stronger than positions. The challenge is that even if the whole team agrees with the leader's assumptions, argument, and idea of a distraction-free environment, they may still prefer their own approach, at least initially. Let's say the employees believe the best way for the company to increase innovation is to embed innovation into every department's operations. They could argue, we also believe innovation is the process of implementing new ideas that add value to the organization, and that departmental operations empower implementation. That's why embedding innovation into every department's operations ensures innovative ideas get implemented. Instead of antagonism or impasse, there's opportunity. As before, if the leaders agree with the team's assumptions, they will also agree with their idea of embedding innovation into operations. Since each side likely still agrees with their own point of view, they've become ambivalents. They're experiencing the dissonance caused by hearing something they can't unhear. Another equally agreeable argument built on pre-existing principles they share, but one that exposes a weakness in their proposal. This is the right kind of dissonance, the kind that leads to a choice between truths. Both sides agree that fewer interruptions lead to more ideas, and departmental operations empower implementation. They also agree on the definition of innovation as the implementation of new ideas that add value. Yet, neither proposal addresses both the implementation and ideation elements of the organization's own definition of innovation. Each approach emphasizes one aspect over the other. By surfacing both the shared yeses and that single point of difference, the two sides can now have a productive, principle-focused discussion about how to resolve it. I love how author and psychotherapist Lauren Slater describes this phenomenon. The sound of something out of tune can also sharpen our ears and seed new songs. Is one of those aspects of innovation truly more important than the other? If so, why? Or are they equally important as the agreed-upon definition suggests? If so, they've laid the groundwork for identifying an improved, alternative approach that aligns even better with what both sides agree on and actively support. When the familiar concepts you're building on are beliefs and desires you share with your stakeholders, you avoid misunderstanding and build trust. Instead of asking people to leap blindly into change, you're guiding them to see your perspective through their lens, and likely expanding your own view and understanding in the process. What gets in the way? One of the most common mistakes in any kind of persuasion is starting from a perspective that's clear to you but alien to your audience. Take the introduction of the iPod. If Steve Jobs had pitched it as a digital MP3 player with 10 megabytes of storage, a liquid crystal display, and a click wheel to play your encoded music, most of us would probably have tuned out. Maybe it's hard to imagine now, but almost every word in that sentence would have been meaningless to a huge proportion of Apple's potential and eventual customers. I call this common mistake the turn-by-turn problem, after the turn-by-turn directions that a navigation system or map application might give you. It's not that turn-by-turn directions aren't important, they are. But usually, you're willing to follow them to the letter only when you're sure they're leading you where you want to go. The same is true for the details of your offering or approach. They matter only after someone understands how they connect to something they already desire. Navigation systems help us describe this problem but also offer a solution. After you enter a destination into Google or Apple Maps, what's the first thing you get? An overview map. That helps verify that the system has both your current and desired locations correct. That's what the famous 1,000 songs in your pocket tagline did. It told people where they were going and how to get there, with the iPod. Their story-making minds did the rest, filling in the details of what those two elements would signify to them, variety and portability, and why they were desirable. The more music, the better. The smaller, the better. Ultimately, the brilliance of that tagline and the challenge for all of us lies in integrating an idea into the audience's existing narrative without overcomplicating it. By aligning a new idea or action with what the audience already knows and believes, you give them a map to follow as you build your case and reduce the risk that drives resistance. What's more, you transfer what resonates for you about a change to your audience, which opens up the opportunity for it to reverberate far beyond you and the moment, into the movements that drive change. Putting it into practice. In his book Never Split the Difference, former FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss says that the sweetest two words in any negotiation are actually, "That's right." Since the decision to change is essentially an internal negotiation, I believe those words apply here too. Unfortunately, it's more common for us to push until we hear someone say, "You're right." But the two phrases aren't the same. The phrase, "You're right," is more like an empty concession, a polite nod, or a desperate attempt to get you to stop talking. But when someone says, "That's right," the situation is different. As Voss explains, "That's right" means someone has assessed what you've said and pronounced it as correct of their own free will. They embrace it. In other words, they haven't just heard you, they've internalized and accepted your point as their own. What's more, they've done it with full agency over their thoughts and actions, all of which adds an indelible scene in the kind of story they're least likely to forget or regret. The stories they tell themselves. When it comes to hearing and adopting a case for change, the more someone says, "That's right," and really, "That's true," the better. Every outcome you outline, every assumption you articulate, and every piece of supporting evidence you submit is an opportunity for someone to exercise their agency and agree that, ding, this change is right for me. If they don't, you know from Chapter 8 what your best option is. Walk away. But if they do agree, even the tiniest yes means that part of the message resonates, which can set the tone for transformational change. When an orchestra prepares to play, the musicians begin by tuning to one another. That process always starts with a single A note played on an oboe. The oboe's sharp, clear, and carrying tone makes it easy for the other performers to hear, no matter what other noises are present. But there's another reason the oboe and its A note were chosen. Every string instrument has an A string, which makes playing the note the easiest and quickest way to get the largest group of instruments in tune at the same time. Since every other type of instrument can also play an A, which is also the most common tuning fork note, those instruments follow, each tuning to the oboe's A. Then, just for a moment, the entire orchestra hits maximum resonance as every instrument plays the same note at the same time. When the entire orchestra is in tune, that's when magic happens. Even when the other instruments go on to play their own part in a piece, the resonance remains, all because of that initial alignment. We feel the power of that happening in great music, even if only in the vibrations it creates. When we have that kind of experience, we want to hear the music repeatedly so that we can feel its power over and over. That's what this kind of approach to change makes possible. When tuned to what people want and believe, one simple note, one simple idea, one simple case can resonate strongly enough to ring true with others, not just once, but over and over again, and inspire transformational change that lasts. My husband and I have two brindle greyhounds, Hazel and Walnut. Both pups are from Ireland and had lived full lives before we adopted them. Walnut was trained to be a competitive racer, and Hazel to be a competitive hunter. Neither dog, however, was trained to be a pet. Since neither of us had worked with an adult dog that way before, we decided to get some help from Vivian, a trainer specializing in human-animal relationships. Vivian explained that dogs have only two intrinsic motivations. Keep doing what they like doing, getting belly rubs. Stop doing what they don't like doing, taking baths. Getting a dog to do anything else requires a negotiation of some kind. However, dogs, as wonderful as they are nonverbal creatures. Even the most artfully constructed argument won't work to change their behavior, though it's fun to imagine it. Walnut, I agree that girl dogs are awesome. Unfortunately, you are no longer able to fruitfully act on that desire. Therefore, leave that girl dog alone. Since dogs can't understand this kind of reasoning, we pet owners rely on extrinsic tools, namely rewards and consequences, to inspire a desired behavior. Needless to say, people are not dogs, and nor are they the cold, rigid steel of the tuning forks in the story that began this book. Thankfully, people understand many more words and are usually capable of understanding reasoning more advanced than, do this and get a treat. They're also, usually, more articulate and expressive than tuning forks. That said, some of the challenges remain the same. Even as advanced a species as we are, people have the same intrinsic motivation defaults as dogs: to keep doing what they like doing and to stop doing what they don't. Despite humans' expanded vocabulary and more advanced reasoning, if you only tell people what new change you want and not the assumptions and principles behind why it makes sense, they, too, can struggle to understand the rationale behind it. Our knowledge of motivation, learning, and persuasion has evolved significantly beyond the rewards and consequences conditioning we use with animals, but our approaches with humans haven't. I hope this book will change that. Each principle I've presented in this book introduces a counterpoint to conventional approaches and is a critical component of understanding how to inspire change that lasts. The only thing you can truly control when inspiring change is how you frame it. Your approach determines the degree of dissonance someone feels and which direction it resolves, in favor of change or against it. Framing a change as an argument structures it for maximum resonance. It puts your case in a form your audience automatically understands, making it easier for them to identify if and where they align with it. People's pre-existing principles determine which arguments they'll align with and which actions they'll take. All that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. Octavia. Butler. Parable of the Sower, 1993. The most reliable source of resonance is alignment with how people want to be seen, as smart, capable, and good. The most reliable source of negative reactions is attacking that identity, even if unconsciously. It's easier for people to change the story they're telling themselves than to change the beliefs and principles that underlie those stories. That's why the most successful cases for change don't challenge old beliefs. They build those old beliefs into new arguments. Your argument for change should alleviate pain, not introduce it. If pain lasts, change won't. Conflict drives choice, and choice drives change. Creating that conflict is your responsibility, but choosing is theirs. If someone doesn't want the outcome of a change or doesn't agree with the principles on which it's based, they'll never agree with the change, and there's nothing more you can do. Indifference is the only obstacle you can't overcome. The key to inspiring lasting change lies in acknowledging and encouraging your audience's agency. That means securing their authentic agreement at each step of your argument, no matter how small. Taken together, these principles produce an approach that isn't about posturing for power, controlling conversations, or overwhelming persuasion. In fact, I'd argue it's not really about persuasion at all. It's about guiding someone through a journey of realizations and agreements. Realizations and agreements that are similar to or the same as the ones you followed before deciding that a particular change was right for you, your organization, or the world. When you think of inspiring change this way, you're much more likely to create a case so aligned with someone's worldview, so reflective of their own thoughts and feelings, that each point you make feels like a confirmation of what they already know and believe. You're also much more likely to say something they can't unhear, and to create, together, a change that lasts.